Regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. Today is Monday, January 14th, 2013. It's shortly after 2 o'clock. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chairman of the committee. I'm joined by Council members Mitch Englander, Bill Rosendahl, and Paul Koretz, and we have a quorum and we're ready to begin. I'd first like to take any public comment cards that we may have, but I see that we have none. If you would like to provide public comment on any of the agenda items or any other matter that this committee has jurisdiction over, please fill out a white card and bring it forward. We're going to take, without objection, members, I'd like to take items 4, 5, and 6 first, because I think our discussion there should be reasonably brief. That way we can complete those items before we move into closed session. So without any objection, we'll go ahead and begin with item number 4. Did we have any public comment on item number 4? Okay, so let's go ahead and...
Sure. Item number 4 was continued from November 19, 2012. Fire Department report relative to the status of the department's fiscal year 2012-13 budget, including the sworn contest staffing overtime account, the department's efforts to switch the fire dispatch center staffing to a 540 work schedule, and efforts to seek reimbursements for ambulance transport costs under AB 678.
All right, so if we could have the fire department come forward, please.
That was a bit of a mumble. I didn't hear it all.
This is the regular report back that we're getting from the fire department on the issues that the committee has asked to be reported back on: constant staffing, overtime, implementation of the 540 work schedule at the MFC, and the status of the AB 678 reimbursements. So, welcome.
Good afternoon. David Yamahata, Deputy Chief, Los Angeles Fire Department. I'm actually waiting for our fire administrator. She should be here shortly.
If you'd prefer to wait, we can wait.
I think it'd be better. She has probably a better handle on our current budget deficit.
That's fine. We'll hold this one on the desk for the moment, and we'll go to item 5, and we'll resume when she gets here.
Sure. Item 5 was continued from January 7th, 2013. It's City Attorney and City Administrative Officer reports relative to the proposed inclusion of 47 law firms in 2012 through 15 attorney conflict panel.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Ann Haley, City Attorney's Office.
Dolores Rivera, CEO's Office.
And Councilman, I don't know that you are familiar with this panel. Of course, this is our conflicts panel, which we seat every 3 years with outside counsel firms that will handle whatever cases we in the City Attorney's Office cannot handle due to a conflict of interest.
And can you just kind of give an overview of the selection process for the panel?
Okay. The overview with the selection process is we released the RFP back in October 2011. At that time, we had approximately, we had approximately 87 responses. There was a pre-screen, and then the interviews were conducted in March of 2012. At that time, the panel was consisted of panelists from the City Attorney's Office. That would be the supervisors from the police litigation, police employment, Ann Haley, LAPD risk management, represented from the CEO's office, and from the mayor's office legal counsel. And at that time we had, and also pensions, a representative from City Attorney's Pensions Division, and from the CEO's Employment Relations Division. And at that time, interviews were conducted, pointed questions were asked, and immediately following the interviews, there was a discussion amongst the panel and votes to select the panels, the firms. What followed afterwards was the decision-making on the rates, and we did have a little bit of a delay in terms of some of with this panel, with these interviews at the time, the CRA was dissolving, and so we had a number of applicants from the CRA formal panel. And so while they had great expertise, we weren't sure whether it created a conflict or not, so we had a little delay with that.
Now, there's a recommended fee schedule that's listed in the report.
Yes.
In what way is that recommended? Is that in fact the agreed-upon fee schedule, or?
Well, not until you say so, Councilman, because that fee schedule was arrived at based on the responses, the various responses that the firm submitted. We looked at those, and really, almost unique to this panel, we came up with a standardized fee schedule that was what we hoped to be kind of a compromise amongst those responses we received across the board.
So if this is approved by the council, that will in fact be the fee schedule applicable to all of the 47 firms that are utilized?
Correct.
Okay, very good. And, well, I'll go to Mr. Englander if he has.
I wanted to ensure that are all the fee structures on the contract with each particular firm the same, where they're perhaps like, they're all billing for the same increment of minimum time? And I don't know if those are quarter-hour minimums or tenth of an hour.
Our minimum billing is 6-minute increments, so
6-minute increment.
0.1. And you'll note there's a two.
And they're all going to be the same
Yes.
across the board on that?
Based on the category.
And the same thing as well for like fax and photocopy and out-of-pocket?
Yes, we have a standard
They're all
across the board.
standardized?
Right. But you will note there's a two-tiered system here that the CAO, Dolores, applies based on the complicated nature of the case that she's assigning. That's why we have the two-tiered possibility.
What triggers it from one complication to the next?
It would be based on the scope of assignment, the magnitude of the case, the complexity, the player, or the person, or the individual, or the individuals assigned for conflict counsel. At that time, to determine the rates, there may be a conversation. Actually, there will be typically a conversation with the deputy city attorney who formally handled the case to get a little bit more idea of the complexities and whether and discussion of the rates.
So it's not necessarily up to the outside firm?
No.
Make the
This is
determination.
made internally within, and then we
Prior
let
to.
the outside firm know this is going to be the rate for this assignment.
Got it.
And sometimes one of the conflicts firms will handle a whole matter, and the city attorney's office is no longer involved, and that tends to be on the more complicated side versus a lawsuit in which the city attorney's office is still involved, handling part of the lawsuit, and outside counsel is conflict counsel is brought in to handle just a part of the litigation.
That would be a situation where there's multiple defendants, for example, and the city attorney is conflicted from representing all of the defendants.
Right. Or where the city attorney would represent the city, perhaps where the city is named and individual defendants.
Right.
Our office would keep the city as our client, as always, and then the conflicts counsel would handle one of the individual
Right.
defendants.
Okay. Colleagues, anything further on this?
I'm just curious, when I'm looking at the numbers, I just want to be clear here. You're saying that the proposed paralegal rate is $100 per hour, but these are the lawyer rates, and so they're the 175 or the 2 1/4 or the 190.
Right, and that would be the lawyer rates, the partner rate, and the associate rate.
And there's no more negotiating that can be done on these numbers?
No. These are the numbers that these would be fixed. And that's why we're proposing the two-tiered, because if there's some latitude, then depending on the complexity of the case, we can go to the higher rate.
Okay, and then the bottom line, of course, it says, approval of these recommendations will have no additional impact on the general fund, as funds have been budgeted in FY 12-13 for this purpose.
Yes.
But what is the overall exposure when you think about it?
It depends on each assignment.
I understand.
Each assignment is unique, and it's made on an as-needed basis, so I wouldn't know until the assignment comes to the attorney conflicts panel.
Is there a way in which you can somehow monitor that so that you can play a role in it and not just get stuck with something?
Yeah, actually, yes. There is a way to monitor that, and that would be actually, what comes to mind is actually the FSR in terms of the liability claims account. cases that have high exposure or cases that have a foreseeable payout within the near future, those are reported to the liability claims account coordinator for tracking purposes.
So then you really know right at that point.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's it with me, thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Kretz, anything? All right, well, without objection, it will be the committee's action to approve the recommendations. So, thank you.
Thank you.
If we ask you the CEO recommendations in the report, yes. Thank you.
All right, so we can now return to item
Item
4, I think. And bring the fire department back up.
Now we know how important you are.
Good afternoon.
We can start the meeting.
Good afternoon. It's been a few weeks.
It has.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year,
Yes,
sir.
indeed.
I'm June Gibson with the Fire Department. So we're back to provide our status update. Starting with the constant staffing overtime, we previously reported that our average expenditures in this account is about $4 million per pay period. We're holding steady with that average. However, there was a slight uptick of about $170,000 for the pay period ending December 29th due to more field staff approved for time off due to the holidays. On the issue of implementing the 40-hour schedule at the dispatch center, at the December 11th EERC meeting, the city attorney was able to finally complete her legal research, and she had opined to the EERC that the process is subject to meet and confer and not just impact bargaining. What that means is that if we reach impasse, we're not going to be able to realize the savings that we had anticipated in our last report. The next bargaining session is scheduled for February the 5th. The CAO's office is now engaged in the process and is negotiating with the department, with UFLAC. We have already begun working closely with the CAO to identify potential savings within our various expense accounts to find a way to address the potential shortfall. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of options available to the department given the fact that our budget is comprised of 95% salaries, and 90% of that is attributable to the sworn salaries. On the issue of AB 678, the Center for Medicare Services will be meeting with the State Department of Healthcare Services this Friday to resolve the remaining outstanding issues with respect to the cost report. We anticipate being informed of the changes being requested by CMS probably no later than 2 weeks after the meeting on Friday, and when we are finally informed of the changes that they're seeking to the cost report, we will be able to modify the cost report probably a week thereafter and resubmit the cost report to the state. In the meantime, there have been lobbying efforts that have been engaged by the fire agencies to the representatives in Washington to encourage CMS to expeditiously approve the process, and our department has engaged the mayor's office in that effort, and they have followed up on that. And we are still optimistic that we'll be able to receive the reimbursements by the end of the fiscal year.
So on that, the expectation was that the request to the federal government would be able to go out by the end of 2012. So that still has not happened. We're still working on the request to the federal government for the reimbursement.
That is true.
Okay. So now the reason that, well, there have been some concerns raised about the impact of the continuing discussions in Washington over deficit reduction and the extension of the fiscal cliff negotiations until March. And some of the cost reductions might still impact on the states. And does the fact that our reimbursement request has not yet gone in leave it vulnerable to potential cuts if Washington's negotiations continue to go south and we have federal budget reductions?
That is one of the questions that we asked the mayor's office to contact our representatives in Washington to try to get clarification from CMS. In addition, we've also asked that the state pose the same questions to the representatives from CMS who are going to be meeting with them on Friday.
Mr. Englander.
Thank you. In addition to, obviously, the AB 678 money and looking at the feds, you mentioned there are a number of other identified savings and offsets. Where are we in identifying exactly what those are, and would they be subject to any other approvals, either by council or other entities or boards or commissions, and where are those things in the process to make up for this difference? And so if you can walk us through those as well.
The last written report we provided to the committee did establish a number of items that we were proposing to address the deficit anticipated at that time of $5.2 million. The greatest amount of the additional revenue sources that we were recommending was reimbursement from water and power. The department has continued to work closely with the Department of Accounting staff as well as the city attorney from water and power to ensure that the reimbursement is legally defensible. The department plans on submitting a request for reimbursement to the Board of Water and Power Commissioners on January 25th, and we're planning on following up with their CFO about that process. In the meantime, the department is requiring that the department establish an appropriate protocol. Specifically, the areas that we're seeking reimbursement is not for the emergency response, because that was an issue that you were concerned about, Councilmember. But what we are seeking reimbursement on is what we call the wait time. That's the period of time after the emergency is mitigated by fire personnel and the wait time before the DWP crews arrive. And the city attorney has agreed that that wait time is a direct service to the department, and for that reason, that reimbursement is legally defensible. Right now, that information is not captured within the CAD system. However, there is a mechanism that the department is considering developing and implementing, which is to have the dispatchers having direct contact with the engine companies so that the time that the mitigation is completed is identified, and then that is the beginning time until they leave the scene for the period of time that we will get reimbursed.
And so is it the desire, are we looking at the idea of the $5.2 million, if I could segregate it to that discussion for 1 second before we look at the other ornaments, if you will. That's $3 million of the 5.2 that's being considered?
Right, that's $3 million. We were anticipating that 1.3 would be comprised of the implementation of the 540 schedule by February. Obviously, we're not going to realize that. The other revenue sources would be as a result of the updated special services fees, which is the inspection fees. We were anticipating $675,000 for that activity. Additional surpluses from other accounts around $200,000, and the pre-inspection services for daycare facilities, which was a new ordinance, approximately $20,000.
So if we just look at those for a minute and look at the fact that we're already in mid-January, I would ask, first of all, I have just an issue and concern with DWP reimbursing for wait time when we're doing that on other types of incidents that we don't bill for. I don't believe we bill for any types of incidents on wait time now. It would be an entirely new type of fee that would then be passed on. We say DWP, but it's the ratepayers. And so we'd want the ratepayer advocate to write a report and review this as well. If we did that, and passing these costs of fire department services onto the actual ratepayers, because that's ultimately who's paying for this, we're also setting a new precedent. And I think we've got to tread lightly and look at that. There's been other concerns. This has been brought up in the past, over the years, the idea of billing DWP for different fees.
And if I can comment on that, that was one of the issues, obviously, that the department was concerned about that we raised with the city attorney. I believe the difference in what was raised in the past was that the department was seeking reimbursement for the entire period of time that they were there.
I understand that.
From the point of time that the 911 call was
Right.
received And the fire company is dispatched.
There's actually been a lot of discussion over the years about charging all different types of fees, quite frankly, not just that particular issue. And what we've got to look at is things that aren't, quote, legally defensible, but morally defensible. We've got to look at things where we've got a fiduciary responsibility, not just to the fire department, but to the ratepayers as well. And all we're doing is the shell game of passing the cost on to the ratepayers. DWP has fired back over the years. This isn't new, where they've said if you're going to attempt to try to do something like this and bill a department that you've never billed for in a service we feel we're already paying for, then we're going to go ahead and bill the city then for the water they use out of our hydrants, or for other fees that they haven't in the past. And so we go through that sort of mix while the department, I believe, was the one that came up with the idea that presented it to the Budget and Finance Committee on the 540 work schedule for the savings. It should have been vetted first to ensure that it wasn't a meet and confer issue, or might have been. In looking at where we're at right now in the fiscal year, the idea that in the process we'd have to go through in order to back bill, and I don't know how we would anticipate $3 million over the next few months to end this fiscal year if it's an anticipation of wait time for incidents that haven't yet occurred. If we haven't captured that time, or we're just going to apply some guesstimate to say over the last year we've waited around approximately so many hours and we haven't captured that data, and that process hasn't yet been figured out and vetted in how dispatch would actually capture the time, or which crews we're waiting around, or how many people we needed to sit there and wait. I don't know how it would be.
Can I provide clarification on your concern with respect to that?
Yes.
The $3 million estimate was based on past experience of the responses that the fire department had provided on 911 calls. And based on the experience of the command staff, they were able to provide an estimate as to what percentage of that time was devoted to wait time and what percentage of time was devoted
Based
to
on what?
emergency response.
Do we have can you show us a report,
Yes.
this committee, showing how they came up with, because estimates in the past, Ms. Gibson, have been way off with the department, as we well know.
No.
And rather than take anybody's, not that the department is wrong on these guesstimates, but we haven't seen actual data to show exactly what this means or any reports. And I think we've got additional scrutiny where we've got to look at this to ensure that these numbers are accurate. And where do they come up with the numbers? And how do they base then what's the math on figuring out which firefighters were waiting for how long and what's their rate calculated at? And so do we have copies of any of this information? And if so, why hasn't it been submitted to this committee?
That information is captured on the CAD. The actual time, the response time following a 911 call is captured. What is not captured is parsing out the wait time. So that is the protocol that the department is developing. Insofar as the period of time for the reimbursement, the general manager has agreed that the reimbursement would be retroactive to July 1st of this fiscal year. So based on the information contained in the CAD, we are able to provide an estimate of the number of incidents going back to
And I have a real problem with backdating and coming up with a new fee and retroactively applying it to guesstimates on information that wasn't necessarily gathered, and particularly for that reason, and to guesstimate on how many boots we had on the ground, waiting for how long, and how much that value is, to come up with a round number of $3.1 million, whatever that number is. I'd like to see how we got there. And the issue of backdating it is certainly not something that I could support going back to ratepayers, even though it may be, there may be a claim that it's legally defensible. In moving on, and so if you could submit that information to this committee,
we'll
so we can
provide a
review
report back.
all of that.
Just for clarification, before you move on, Mr. Englander, on that point, before reimbursement is finalized, that decision will have to come back before this committee and be approved by the council. Is that right? So, or was that the expectation? Because we have a report before us today, but I assume before that reimbursement is implemented, after the analysis is completed and so on, that request for reimbursement will come back before this committee and be approved by council, will it not?
Well, my understanding is that the Water and Power Commission has the authority to approve that.
Okay. And is the council required to vote to accept it?
I think if the council wants to take up the issue, then they have to.
245.
Yes, 245 it.
Okay.
And an
Well-
issue would either be here or in E&E.
Very good. Then let's just add to a future report the requests that Mr. Englander has indicated. I had expected that this would come back before us for a vote, and we would have that information before us then, but if not, then let's be sure to have it on a future report before before we run out of time to act on that.
But I would put a high likelihood of possibly somebody somewhere submitting a 245 should the DWP act to reimburse the costs, to see that information as well, if nothing more, and to open up public discussion on it. And then with that, the issue, just moving on, the surpluses, I don't know if you've given us an outline of, you said to sweep the surpluses, and that was about $675,000?
No, it was 200,000.
It was $200,000?
Mhm.
And the surpluses consisted of what? It was $205,000, correct?
Right.
Where were the surpluses derived from?
Our expense accounts.
And if you can submit a list of what those were perhaps as well, and give us a breakdown of the $205,000 on that. And the inspection of the $675,000 was the updated special service fees for inspection activities?
Correct.
Can you walk us through that?
I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but it's an annual ordinance that is an update, an amendment to those ordinances that are transmitted to council to provide an adjustment to the various inspection fees that are implemented by the department, and that was approved several
Aren't those
months ago.
required to be only cost recovery?
Yes.
So if those were cost recovery, how could there be an influx of $675,000 that's not accounted for?
It's the increase. It's the increase from the previous fiscal year.
Right, but isn't there then also a decrease based on the fact that they were cost recovery? In other words, if we've spent the time and resources on one hand, and then we updated the fees to cover that time and resources, isn't that a wash?
I'm not sure what you mean.
No, because the expense is already in the budget, but the fees are not.
I see.
So-
Okay, so we budgeted for the expense, but we never
I'm assuming
updated.
that-
So we're retroactively collecting?
Well, that was one of the questions that I asked the staff, is whether or not that $675,000 was included as part of anticipated revenues within the current year budget. The answer that was told to me by the budget staff was no, the $675,000 was not included as part of the budget. That's why this is expected to be additional revenues.
Okay, but additional revenues that are cost,
Yeah.
okay, I understand. And then the pre-inspection services for daycare facilities, this is a new fee,
Yes,
is that correct? Has
Yes.
that ordinance yet been voted on?
yes,
And so that's already implemented?
yes.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kretz?
So, just to clarify, so the DWP reimbursements wouldn't technically be considered a new fee? Or would they?
Well, it's not a fee.
So
Currently, the cost of that is being borne by the taxpayers. So, and the representation, by the council member is, that it's he's referring to it as a shell game. I'm not sure whether or not, that representation is the wording that I would use, but currently it's being paid by the taxpayers, and the question then becomes, should it be borne by the general fund, or if it's a service that is being provided directly to Water and Power, should Water and Power reimburse the general fund for those costs? That's not dissimilar to other reimbursements that are frankly processed by the CAO's office for staff work provided by the CAO's office, for work provided by the Treasurer's office, as well as other departments wherein the services are being provided directly to Water and Power. So that's a similar situation wherein if we don't get reimbursed by water and power, then that cost is being borne by the taxpayers.
Right, it seems, at least in my point of view, it seems like a reasonable approach to have the entity that's actually getting the service pay for that service. As far as the switch to the 45 work week, since we know now that we're negotiating this, what's the anticipated worst-case scenario in terms of time?
We're anticipating that the implementation is not going to occur until next fiscal year. As I indicated, if it does go to impasse, the fact-finding process is fairly lengthy. I believe that the Employer Relations Ordinance requires that if you declare impasse, that the fact-finding process must be completed within 120 days. So, that is going to take us, into
All right,
the...
just put
into
Linda
next
in the
fiscal
front
year.
row. I'm going to recognize her.
Any idea how far into the next fiscal year?
Yeah,
To be perfectly honest, it's a brand-new administration within UFLAC. So I'm really not quite sure how negotiations is going to go with this new team. We could be a little bit more optimistic, and hope that it may be sooner rather than later. But when it comes to meet and confer, I'm usually not optimistic about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I could just use personal privilege and introduce Linda Lux. Linda is the president of the Association of Governments, and they just had their meeting down the hall there, Linda, didn't you? That's what I mean, Neighborhood Commissioners, which is an overall group for all of the commission. We want to thank you for sticking your head in here.
Good to see you.
I have a couple of questions, if I could.
Fire away.
Let me just start off with the biggest, no firing around here. My biggest question is going to be, what about Dr. Pickle? Where's the pickle in the mix? He's got to see all this stuff. I mean, we hired this guy. We're paying a lot of money for him to sit there. He's got to know what he's doing. And we got to know what he's doing so that we feel comfortable he's doing the right thing. That's all I ask of that. The Neighborhood Council group has said they want 60 days for sure to let that process go on. In fact, she's just nodding her head as she's leaving. It's all about due process and getting people engaged. Obviously, there wasn't enough trust among the citizenry with DWP and other issues. But the bottom line is, it's the pickle question. And we're in a pickle until you're able to give me Dr. Pickle as part of the package. How do you feel about the pickle? Are we in a pickle? Little humor in
Given
this.
so much discussion today on this topic, we may be.
Yeah.
In our discussions with the general manager and with their chief financial officer, clearly this reimbursement was not budgeted as part of the rates for the current year, and my understanding is that are the rates established for a couple of years, but there was an expectation that ultimately these are considered to be capital costs. So the reimbursement was going to be borne by incorporating this, as part of their capital program, because it is related to their capital assets. So
We're talking about 6 people, right? That's what our bottom line is here. A staff of 6 people. For Pickle.
in terms of responding,
For Pickle, yeah, to have a staff of 6 people, so he knows what he's doing. They can help him ferret out the issues.
oh,
Well, I don't think that's the fire department's issue. The question here is really
Oh,
whether
yeah,
this is
right.
reimbursable. And I assume that Dr. Pickle will have the opportunity to weigh in on this if the board, refers it, and perhaps even if they don't, he'll certainly have heard this discussion. We'll have the opportunity to weigh in on whether this is something that would have a material impact on ratepayers. I don't think it's appropriate for the ratepayer advocate to make policy choices,
Yeah.
certainly. But in assessing whether or not there's a ratepayer impact, that would be an appropriate role for the
Yeah, but Mr.
Ratepayer.
Chair, what is your take on this constant staffing business as a strategy? I mean,
Well-
that's an issue we have ourselves with it, if we believe in that or not.
Yeah, I would say how we approach that in terms of fire service response is a matter more appropriate at the Public Safety Committee.
I would
but-
say
But I
that's
do want to
more
make sure that we're
appropriate.
that we're budgeting the appropriate cost of it so long as we
Right.
have it.
Right.
And that seems to be where we've fallen a bit short on this.
That's right.
So, all right. If there's nothing further then, members, we'll just continue this item, and thank you very much for the update. If there's anything that we can do to provide further assistance on AB 678, please call upon us.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Thank you. So that brings us now to item number 6.
6. Item 6 is the CAO report relative to the Inspector General's report on review of the proposed request for proposal for property tax allocation, audit, and recovery services, and review of other citywide tax allocation audit services.
Good afternoon. Fernando Campos, Inspector General with the Office of the City Administrative Officer. Pleasure to be in front of your board, this committee again, to provide an update on a review for the Property Tax Allocation Audit and Recovery Services, an RFP, a request for proposal that was submitted by the Office of the City Controller. In addition to that, the report in front of you provides an update on a review of other citywide tax allocation audit services that I conducted through my review. Just to give you some context behind the item before you, the request was to look at opportunities for consolidation and also efficiencies in our tax allocation services. Property taxes alone represent a little over a third, or about $1.4 million of the general fund receipts. The other citywide tax items that I have before you in the report are the top 10 tax types. Those tax types represent about 71%, or about $3.2 million of the $4.5 billion in general fund receipts. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the magnitude of this, of review of the tax allocations. There's 4 major findings that I will briefly provide you, and also 4 major recommendations behind those findings. The first is that the RFP, in reviewing the RFP, it appeared to be consistent and also very routine in terms of releasing the RFP for property tax allocation services. There was no major modifications or major changes that I'm proposing to the RFP. However, there are some areas where we can increase clarity. That clarity idea, the clarity areas could be that the controller should consider to include unsecured property taxes, also homeowner exemption, supplemental taxes, redemptions as part of their scope of work. It is covered under the property tax line according to the budget. In addition to that, they can also increase clarity in terms of the selection process, when interviews may be held and when a selection item, a final selection may be before you for consideration. Those 2 items will provide clarity not only through the selection and the RFP process, but also it'll provide an opportunity for us to, or for the city to capture all property tax related items that are being audited. The second finding is looking at potential consolidations. The opportunity for consolidations are threefold. The first was looking at possibly consolidating the sales tax replacement and also the sales and use tax. Those 2 tax types are separated. However, at this time, my report recommends that we should not consolidate those 2 tax types, simply because the sales tax replacement redirects about 1/4% of the city sales tax to the state, which pays for economic bonds. The sales and use tax is paid by the consumer directly to the city tax. The sales tax replacement comes in through the property tax, which is a tax roll item. The sales tax comes in through a different revenue stream. So at this point, although they are some similar in nature, the recommendation is not to consolidate those. In addition to that, the city has already consolidated the city's utility tax program, which is the electric users and telephone tax. Those have already been consolidated. And the last is the documentary transfer tax. That was transferred over to the Office of Finance approximately in late 2010. Since then, the Office of Finance is preparing a tax discovery program so that they can do the audits of the documentary transfer tax. The third finding talks about efficiency opportunities. There are some tax types that are being highlighted in the report that have not yet been audited, and those include the sales tax replacement, also administrative costs that the city pays to the LA County for administering the property tax roll for us, which represents approximately $20 to $22 million in annual payments to the county. In addition to that, property tax refunds. The last recommendation is looking at outstanding contracts that have not yet been let to audit other city tax types. For example, in March 2012, the council directed the Office of Finance to look at all tax types that may have a contract in place or not have a contract in place for auditing services. My review identifies 3 opportunities for us to move forward. One is the city utility tax, which are the electric, gas, and telephone tax. That contract expired back in January 2011 and has not yet been renewed by the Office of Finance or presented to your body for consideration by the Office of Finance. In addition to that, the business tax contract expired in January 2010. Again, it's still outstanding and no new contract is in place. And last but not least, the documentary transfer tax auditing service contract has expired since June 2010 and not in place at this point. I did reach out to the Office of Finance in terms of where they are with those pending contracts because that's an opportunity missed for us in moving forward with their tax auditing services. The Office of Finance indicates that within the 90-day period, they would return back to this body for consideration for those new contracts. At that point, it was December, so I'm anticipating a proposal from the Office of Finance by the end of February.
Great. Thank you very much. Members, any questions on this? Otherwise, it would be the recommendation to approve the IG's recommendations.
Great, thank you.
And that will be...
Question
Yes,
for you.
Mr. Rosendahl.
Yeah, when you see this property transfer tax and all that, what kind of monies are you talking about the homeowners would end up paying?
For the line item for homeowners,
Yeah.
approximately there's about 8.5 million. That's what we receive right now. But in terms of auditing, the percentage is minimal. In that case, it's less than 1/1000th of a percent. So it's not going to be a major impact for us. However, it's an opportunity for the auditors to go in there and comprehensively look at the whole property tax line, as it's called in the budget.
When you look at the measure we're putting on the ballot in the spring, does that capture those monies, or how does that deal with it? If you were a constituent, what would your sensing be of this, just from your perspective?
In terms of the documentary transfer or the sales tax?
Strategy.
It's probably outside right now. I haven't given much thought about it. I could provide a response to you more formal after I go through analysis, but...
Yeah, I'd like to see what analysis, because my theory is obviously that my folks in my district are better off with this half-cent sales tax than they would be if they had to pay more property tax and more other taxes and all of that.
In the interim, I can also reach out to, I believe there's an ad hoc group that has been convened to discuss the sales tax, and I can reach out to that group to provide information, and if there's any discussions that need to happen between my office and that group, I'd be more than happy to do so.
Yeah, we'd love to get that information, right, Mr. Chair?
Well, certainly with regard to collections issues, it would be within the province of the IG to comment on that, to be sure. So, as to this report on the matters before us, if there's nothing further, it'll be the action of the committee to approve the recommendations. Thank you. All right. Now, do we yet have any cards on any of the closed session items? All right, so seeing no cards on the closed session items, the public comment on those items is now closed. And do we have anything else other than the closed session items?
That takes care of all of the open session items.
All right, then let's proceed first to item number 3 of the closed session matters, and then we'll pick up 1 and 2 after we're done with that.
And if I may, I will read the instruction. Basically, the committee may recess in the closed session.
Actually, before we do, Mr. Geis, is that order appropriate to go with 3 first? Okay. All right, go ahead.
Peter, Pete, right here.
I'll just read. The city, or the committee may recess in the closed session pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9, Section D2 and E2, to allow the committee to confer with its legal counsel on the following matter.
And the only remaining item on the agenda is general public comment. Is there anyone wishing to offer general public comment? Seeing none, public comment is closed, and we are adjourned.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good work, guys. What's next?